Welcome, friends, to Christian Formation, coming to you from the Church of the Redeemer in Sarasota. I'm Father Ralph Strom on the staff here, and I've been presenting a series entitled The Moral Courage of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. And I should reiterate what I've said before in these sessions, that this is not designed to be a complete story of Dr. King's life or a composite emphasizing certain things and not others. It's rather a very personal series on my part, sort of cherry picking different events and so forth in his life that reflected to me the really core or focus of the series, and that is his moral courage. So in this presentation, number 8, and the last in the series, I'll describe briefly what happened that led King to be in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4th, 1968. And this presentation is entitled Requiem in Memphis. As I record this session, I'm doing it on Thursday afternoon, September 30. It's going to be shown for the first time, or at least it's scheduled to be shown on Friday, October 1st at 6:30. But as I record this session, I will show photographs from a book. Our plan, however, is that when this recording is edited, the photos you see will have been embedded in the recording itself. In this series, I have used a simple definition of moral courage in relation to King. And it's this: as a Christian and as a Christian pastor, what did King feel morally called to do and why? King never stopped believing that nonviolent resistance was the way to address injustice, despite the call by many to adopt other methods, including those of violence. During much of the latter part of 1967 and into 1968, King crisscrossed the United States raising money for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, of which he was the leader, and recruiting for what was planned to be called a Poor People's Campaign. This campaign would involve an actual march to Washington, D.C. from the Deep South by poor people, and then to stay in Washington until the federal government truly did something about economic injustice. King had recognized that after the freedom movement had set free blacks of the Deep South from the legal yokes of segregation, he understood that more was needed, and namely economic justice for all Americans was what he was about. So on a rainy day, and there were thunderstorms in early February in 1968 in Memphis, the sanitation workers reported to work, but they were all sent home, or should have gone home, because of the weather. In their paychecks that week, black employees had received wages for only 2 hours for that day. White workers were paid for the entire day. So the Union of Black Workers sent a list of demands to the newly elected mayor of Memphis, Henry Loeb, who promptly ignored all their demands. In addition, because of city rules against seeking shelter in bad weather in residential areas, 2 of those black sanitation workers had crammed into a sanitation truck's rear cylinder to get out of the rain, and then were crushed to death accidentally by the garbage compactor. So these 2 deaths precipitated a walkout with a special slogan to indicate the dead workers' humanity, and the slogan was, "I am a man." And I want to show you now a photograph of the march. Now, the photograph I have is taken later, after King was assassinated, and you can after the National Guard was brought in. But let me show you an example of this. You can see the National Guard there with bayonets on one side and tanks on the other, and the line of protesters or marchers with that saying, "I am a man." And you might notice also that in this photograph, at least, the third man back is not a black man, but a white man with a shirt and tie. So it was an integrated march as well. I am a man, pointing to the dead workers' humanity, and also the humanity of all all workers. The situation in Memphis did not initially attract King's attention because he was busy elsewhere in the South organizing his Poor People's Campaign. But King was finally tracked down by phone and yielded to the plea of his colleague in the freedom movement, and at the time, the pastor of a church in Memphis, Jim Lawson. And Lawson wanted him to support the strike in Memphis. So on March 18th, with Lawson, King, as it has been described, quote unquote, addressed a rousing crowd of 15,000 at the vast Masonic temple in Memphis, inspired by an embattled struggle so imbued with his national purpose, which of course was then economic injustice. After that speech, King offered to return to Memphis. The leaders of the economic protest in Memphis called for an all-out work stoppage on March 28, and King agreed to lead an accompanying march in Memphis. When he arrived in Memphis the morning of March 28, he became disturbed because of the presence of Black Power militants among the peaceful marchers. King was told that these Black Power advocates would not be a part of the march. However, after the march began and went for just 3 blocks, these Black Power people began breaking into stores and looting. And at this point, King was taken away from the parade and returned to his motel because it was feared by his associates that his life was in danger. In the chaos of this looting and breaking into stores, a 16-year-old black youth was shot and killed by police. 60 others were clubbed and wounded by police, and over 280 people were arrested. Looting and arson continued that day until the governor of Tennessee called in 4,000 National Guardsmen. Now, I want to show you a second photo. And this was taken during the looting and the arson. And as you can see, the police, those who are protesting and or doing looting and arson are being cornered by the police on the sidewalk, and some of them have clubs. And so again, there was violence and many injuries as a result of this. King was unaware of the size of the group of Black Power advocates in Memphis, and it was large. And he and his Southern Christian Leadership Conference associates had not planned the march either. And yet, well, not yet, this is yet another example of King's being pulled into a protest which he had not planned and he had no control over. This same being pulled into protest occurred a number of times over his lifespan. And in one of my earlier sessions, for example, I described the same thing in relation to the protests that occurred in Albany, Georgia, years before. Nevertheless, King had become very shaken by the violence, and he felt responsible for it. So he was determined to prove that nonviolent resistance was still the most effective method of forcing social change. One of the marks, I think, of his moral courage is that he felt called, and therefore responsible, for any of the protests or demonstrations he participated in, whether or not he and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference planned the protest or demonstration. He was, I think, so committed to nonviolent resistance that he could not say no to involvement even where there was violence occurring, but not on his part or his followers. So as a result of this, King scheduled a second march in Memphis for April 8th. The city of Memphis quickly secured a court injunction against it, and while King worked legally to get the injunction nullified, he went ahead and announced his intention to lead the march anyway. That never happened. He was assassinated by a sniper while standing on the balcony of his second-floor room at the Lorraine Motel in the late afternoon of April 4th. James Earl Ray, the accused sniper, was sought, captured, and later convicted of murder. And as I remember it, he died in prison. I want to show you now a very iconic photo, probably the most famous one involving King's assassination. This is a picture of the balcony. You can see King lying on the balcony floor. There's a white handkerchief placed over the right side of his head. And I think it's Ralph Abernathy who's leaning over him and holding the handkerchief on his head. To Abernathy's right is, I believe, Andrew Young, and they're all pointing to where they think the shooter was at. It is unclear from this photo whether King has died yet or he's still alive. King was often threatened and lived in constant danger. He had spoken a number of times about his own death, not with fear or with self-pity. And he's quoted as having said, "A man who won't die for something is not fit to live." So I'm going to close this session and the series by reading a few selected quotes from King's last speech, given at the Masonic Temple in Memphis on the evening of April 3rd, the night before he was killed. The words describe himself at the time of death. This speech is known as the "I've been to the mountaintop" speech. I encourage you to watch the video of this. There was a video made that was at the time. And if you have your search browser, whatever you're using, whether it's a laptop, desktop, tablet, or smartphone, just type in the search bar of the browser you use and type in the name of the speech. "I've been to the mountaintop" speech, Martin Luther King. And there's also a great number of other photos and videos on the internet of King throughout his life, and I encourage you to look at those as well. It is my hope that this series will have stimulated you to read more history. I felt for a long time that as Americans, many of us don't know enough about our history. And what's more troubling is we don't really care about it. We should care about it. I want to thank you for watching, and God bless you all. And now some of the last words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., spoken in Memphis the night before he was killed. Let us rise up tonight with a greater readiness. Let us stand with a greater determination. And let us move on in these powerful days, these days of challenge, to make America what it ought to be. We have an opportunity to make America a better nation. Now, it doesn't matter now. It really doesn't matter what happens now. I left Atlanta this morning, and as we got started on the plane, there were 6 of us. The pilot said over the public address system, "We are sorry for the delay, but we have Dr. Martin Luther King on the plane. And to be sure that all of the bags were checked and to be sure that nothing would be wrong on the plane, we had to check out everything carefully. And we've had the plane protected and guarded all night." And then I got into Memphis, and some began to say the threats or talk about the threats that were out and that what would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And so I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.